Hey everybody, today is Monday, April 1st, 2024. Coming up on the show today, from Roadhouse, editor Doc Crotzer.
So much of this process is always about trying things and seeing if they work or not. And for me, the best way to do that is you try it and then you show it to people who aren't in the room all day. All we're really trying to do with any of this stuff when we're cutting a scene together is give the illusion that this is all playing out in real time, but none of it is ever playing out in real time when you're shooting it. I mean, this is Roadhouse, so what's a better way in than point of view punching someone in the face?
Yes, all that and more on this edition of The Rough Cut. All right, who's up for some fun? You can't see me, but I'm raising my hand. I hope you are too. Unless you're driving, keep both hands on the wheel, 10 and 2 and all that. No, you just sit back and relax because today on the show, we are talking about Roadhouse. As you probably know, Roadhouse was a movie that originally came out in 1989. It starred Patrick Swayze as Dalton, a man well known in certain circles as a cooler, which is kind of like a head bouncer but badder, because everyone knows him. Plus he meditates. So he's a tough guy, and he's an intellectual, but he also has a troubled past. Suffice to say, the 1989 film Roadhouse was not up for any Oscars. Yet 35 years later, not only are we still talking about it, they are remaking it. And in case you were wondering, the Oscar for Best Picture in 1989 went to Rain Man. Jury's out on when they'll remake that one. But I am sure it's just a matter of time. But the time is now for a remake of Roadhouse, and that is courtesy of director Doug Liman. Doug has been on the podcast before, and he's a fun interview, so give it a listen when you have a minute. Someone else who's been on the podcast before, twice even, is Doc Crotzer, who cut Roadhouse for Doug. Doc's a terrific guy, a great editor, and a very fun interview in his own right. His first time on the Rough Cut was for another Doug Liman movie, Chaos Walking. The next and most recent time we talked to Doc was for the action comedy Shotgun Wedding. And it was at that time, I think after we were done recording, that Doc told me he was doing a remake of Roadhouse with Doug Liman. And he had me at remake of Roadhouse with Doug Liman. And now it's here. It follows a similar framework to the original. In this film, Dalton is an ex-UFC fighter, again with a troubled past, who gets hired to be the cooler at a roadhouse, called the Roadhouse, down on the Florida Keys. I could go on and tell you more, but why would I do that when we have Doc here to give you the real story? And we will do that in a couple minutes. First I gotta find the links to those older interviews with Doug and Doc. But I can do two things at once. Two's my max, but I can do it. While I am hunting around for those links, let me tell you a little bit about our friends at Extreme Music. Now, you probably know Patrick Swayze's Dalton was famous for saying, "Pain don't hurt." Personally, I disagree. Pain do hurt, especially at my age. And you know what else hurts? Having lousy music in your movie or TV show. So if you or any of your hip content creator friends want to make amazing movies, amazing TV, or amazing anything, you need to visit our benevolent sponsor, Extreme Music. For over 25 years, they have given filmmakers and artists just like you the very best in movie music or TV music. Music created by multi-award-winning musicians and composers. Multi means more than one. Great music from names you've heard of and some you haven't heard of. Heard of yet, that is. You will, because they're great. For your part in all this, all you need to do is go to their website, sign up for a free account, and dive headfirst into a deep, refreshing pool of production audio. Audio that features any kind of music your little heart desires. It's actually pretty fun and really simple to do. All online, or they can personally lend a hand from one of their many, many worldwide offices. And you don't just get the finished track. You can get it in all kinds of flavors, right down to the stems, so you can go with vocals or no vocals, or just the keyboard track or no keyboard track. It is all up to you to decide. So make one of the best decisions you could ever make, and partner up with Extreme Music to make your story sound its very, very best. You still with me? Good, because here's a little more news for you. If you head on over to blog.frame.io/theroughcut, you can enjoy The Rough Cut as a transcripted, uplifted, regifted, full-on multimedia experience. What the hell does that mean, you ask? Well, it's like this. Over at the blog, you can read the podcast. Everyone says I talk too fast. Well, read me as slowly as you want. But it's a lot more than that. Along with the transcript, you get images like behind-the-scenes photos and avid timeline shots. You get videos of the YouTube variety where you can see trailers and educational videos that help explore the topics we discuss. You can even get music in the form of Spotify playlists of the soundtrack of the film or TV show we're covering. Plus, you can listen to the podcast at the same time with the embedded podcast player. Where do you get all that great stuff? Well, I already told you, but I'll tell you again. blog.frame.io/The Rough Cut. Okay, no need to wait any longer. The doctor will see you now. From Roadhouse, here's editor Doc Crotzer.
Let's do it. All right.
All of a sudden, you can't see anything.
I'm with you, man.
It's painful.
Yeah.
All right, Doc. Well, the first time we did one of these interviews was for a little film called Chaos Walking, which you cut for director Doug Liman. Doug is also the director of this film, Roadhouse. So I'd like to know, how far back did Doug mention Roadhouse to you, and what did he say about where he wanted to go with it?
I don't remember exactly when I first heard about Roadhouse, but it was at least half a year before production started. I don't even think it was completely greenlit at that point, but Doug thought that it was looking like it would be his next project. And he reached out to tell me he thought I would be great for it and to see if I'd want to do it. And of course, as a fan of all things 80s movies, it was something that was an immediate yes. I was like, yep, let's figure it out. I'm ready to go. So that was kind of how it started. And then, of course, that was well in advance, but I had a lot to look forward to as we got closer to shooting in it and closer to me coming on.
This film has a lot of fighting, a lot of one-on-one combat. I think it's to your credit that as I look at your background, I don't think you can really be pigeonholed anywhere, which is a great thing to be. But at the same time, I wouldn't look at you and go, here's Doc, he's your basic heavy action kind of editor. Obviously, Doug had faith in you, but for you, did you look at it like, wow, this is a little out of my comfort zone? Or even did the studio think for a second, like, well, Doug, we know you love Doc, but he hasn't done really heavy action before.
I mean, it wouldn't surprise me if there were conversations between Doug and other people that I wasn't privy to that were similar to what you described for that very reason. You know, I don't have a list of 10 big budget action movies under my belt. And I would imagine, given the cost of these movies, that, you know, there were some people who were like, well, why don't we just get something that's a little more sure thing in their mind? I would think, knowing kind of how Doug and I work and how he believes in me, certainly I would imagine his response was like, no, this guy is the sure thing in his mind, which is, I'm sure, why I wound up being on the movie at all. But yeah, it was fun going in because it felt like a new challenge. As you mentioned, like, I've done a lot of action, but this is primarily, in my mind, an action movie that happens to be very funny. Whereas I think in the past, a lot of the action I've done on the feature side has been a comedy movie that has action, with Shotgun Wedding. Although Chaos Walking had a lot of action, but that was its own kind of animal. So I went in knowing it would be a challenge. I was really excited about it. And also knowing that the fight scenes, having spoken with Doug, were going to be shot in a way that was pretty unique and different from how most movies do it and how Doug had done it in the past. And I think that's one of the things that he got really excited about as far as doing the movie, was he saw it as an opportunity to approach fight scenes in a completely different way. And I think when he did the first Bourne movie, he also saw that as an opportunity to approach fight scenes in a totally different way, which of course was one of the things that spawned a whole new way of how fight scenes were cut and put together in movies. So I think this was kind of, in his head, the next version of that. And subsequently, like, I got really excited about that challenge. And to your point about being pigeonholed, that's always something I'm thinking about. We don't always have the luxury of being super strategic. Sometimes you're fortunate enough that you are picking and choosing between jobs, and sometimes you just got to work. But whenever I can, I try and do things that are a little different from what I've done before, and especially try and do things that are different from the most recent thing that I did, for that very reason, because I don't want to get pigeonholed as one thing or the other.
You brought up Doug's shooting style, which I think is something we're going to touch on a few times here. I generally ask editors what they thought of the script when they read it. But something I don't usually ask is another first that an editor experiences, and that's the first thing that you looked at. Did that inform anything or change anything that you had perceived going in, I guess?
Yeah, it definitely does, because it's never exactly like what you imagine when you read the script. And hopefully it's more interesting and more dynamic and all of that. And certainly I think with this movie, the fight scenes and that style of shooting came to life visually in a way that you just can't compare to reading what's happening on a page, you know? And I think the way that Henry, the DP, moved the camera, his whole camera setup is really remarkable. It's this handheld rig that's on some sort of specialized gimbal. It sort of looks like a Movi situation, but it's his own version of this that is unique to him. And it allows for this quick movement that you see in the movie, quick but very precise movement with the camera, where you don't really feel the like traditional float of some of that gimbal stuff, but it allows him to kind of do these incredible movements and capture what's happening on screen, like the choreography of the fights, in a way that you couldn't do if you were on dolly track. You couldn't do it if you were on a steady cam. It wouldn't feel the same if you were simply handheld. So that in and of itself with the footage, when you look at the raw footage, gives it kind of a distinct feel, I think, and certainly informed kind of how we were going to do things moving forward. I mean, the North Star, I think, was whenever possible, if it feels completely believable, let's just let this play out on screen. And the fight sequences were designed and shot in a way that we could stitch things together and do kind of enhancements so that you were seeing punches hitting people in angles that you don't normally see in movies. Because traditionally, in some of these angles, if you were in that shot, you would just see that the actors are pulling their punches and there's a 1.5 feet between them and it wouldn't feel real. But because of how everything was so like meticulously choreographed, shot, and then put together, we were able to use angles and have moments of action playing out in certain ways that normally you'd be cutting around because it wouldn't feel real. So it was really exciting. And from the beginning, that was, I think, one of the most exciting things for me.
Having that experience with Doug on Chaos Walking, were there aspects of how you worked with him or how you two worked together that evolved going into Roadhouse? Or were there specific things from your experience working with Doug that you said, okay, next time that we sit down together, I know to do it this way?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the best things about working with someone multiple times is you're continuing always to refine and develop a shorthand with each other and a trust. And I think over the course of Chaos Walking, certainly we developed a deep trust, and it was easier with this one for me to just slide back into it with him and our rhythms. And I would imagine he would say the same, just because by that point we had done it so much more together than when I first started Chaos Walking with him. So it makes a big difference. And I think it's one of the things also that anytime there's a shorthand that is possible, I'm all for it. Whether that shorthand is the communication shorthand between a director and an editor, whether the shorthand is some sort of avid keyboard shortcut that I just learned that saves me 3 seconds from how I used to do something. All of those shortcuts ultimately lead to more time just working on the creative part of movie making. And the more time we have with the creative, the better.
When you're doing a reboot, reimagining, whatever you want to call it, do you go back and watch the first one and be conscious of the things that you want to honor and the things that you think, you know what, we're going to take a different approach to it this time?
So I went back and watched the original, which I had seen growing up, of course, multiple times, although I don't know that I had ever seen it in one sitting, like one full sitting, commercial free, but I had seen it 100 times otherwise. But I made a really conscious choice to not go back and revisit it before starting this one. Having read the script, I thought there's going to come a point where I will revisit this, but I don't want it to be at the start. I want it to be where we're further along with the movie, because we have to make this one work and stand on its own first. Because if we can't do that, then I don't think it will be successful for audiences at all. And then once we're there, I think sort of being aware of the original and thinking about kind of the dials that you can turn of how far do we want this homage or this moment or this reference or this Easter egg? Do we want it? Do we not want it? And figuring out, as you say, like the right mix and the right balance of that so that the movie works for people who haven't seen the original, or maybe works for people who saw the original but didn't love it. But then also the people who love the original, there are enough things in there for them where it's extra fun as they go on the ride of the movie. So we actually did. It was really fun. Towards the end of post, we went to a screening at the Alamo Drafthouse in Brooklyn one night, and we took the whole crew. It was Doug, Joel, pretty much our whole post team. And we just went and saw the original with an audience at the Alamo Drafthouse, and it was an absolute blast. And it was like the perfect time and perfect reminder for us, because we weren't totally done with the movie, but we were really close to being finished. And yeah, it was the right time to revisit it then for me. I'm not sure like how much Doug watched or referenced the original. I don't think he did consistently. I'm sure, when they were developing the script, and obviously Anthony and Chuck, the writers, referenced the original, and They had so many smart like morsels in the script that made their way into the movie, I think, that are fun.
There's a restaurant in the film called Double Deuce.
Yeah.
Jake gets to drop the line, "No one ever wins a fight," which is one of Patrick Swayze's iconic lines from the original.
Yep.
Sometimes on these like Marvel movies, the editors will get almost a little Bible for, these are the things we want to make sure we hit in the film.
We didn't have anything formal like that. Our litmus test was always with any of those types of things. Like, one, does it fit authentically with what's on screen? And then two, does it make us smile or laugh or whatever? And that was really the test. And if it felt fun and if it felt like it wasn't too winky or pull you out of the movie you were watching and make you think about the old movie, then it worked.
So you mentioned going to the screening in Brooklyn. I'm assuming you also cut New York, either that or you really, really wanted to go to that screening. Tell me about where you cut, the setup, things like that.
Yeah, we cut the movie in New York at a place called Assembly Post in NoHo. And we had a great team, and Post was quite long on this movie because of the strike. We were close to finishing, but then the strike happened. So we kept doing work on the movie for a while and then paused for a bit and came back to do ADR and our mix and final color and all of that. But yes, all of that was done in New York. The only parts of the movie that we did outside New York were the audience previews. We did those in LA.
Has your editorial setup evolved at all from Chaos Walking to Shotgun Wedding and now to Roadhouse?
It really hasn't changed too much. I try and keep it pretty simple. The biggest thing for me that varies project to project is whether or not I'm using one giant ultra wide or whether I'm using like 3 monitors. And I love the ultra wides, but sometimes they just go on the fritz and then your monitor's broken and it's a pain. And the 3 monitor setup is a little safer, I think. So I go back and forth, but I love the screen real estate and just kind of having one monitor to immerse yourself in. So that's probably the only thing consistently that's changed for me since we last talked about it. Everything else is pretty straightforward. I use a vertical mouse now instead of a trackball because my wrist was hurting. But, you know, at some point my wrist will start hurting from the vertical mouse and I'll go back to a trackball or I'll go to the pad or whatever, you know.
It's good to be adaptable as an editor. In terms of connectivity, like sharing cuts with Doug, working with your assist or the other crew, how were you connected? How were you sharing?
For this one, we were using Pix to distribute cuts and things. And then, you know, we had Jump Desktop, so we could remote in if needed. I think the crew, the assistants used that sometimes, especially when there were requests at odd hours for cuts and things like that. But for the most part, this one was like everyone back in the office every day, kind of like the good old days, pre-COVID filmmaking, which was really fun. We had a wonderful time together and it was just such a special group of people. And I think everyone really enjoyed that we were kind of all in this space together. And, you know, we had an office full of dogs and it was just, there was always something exciting going on outside of the work we were doing, which I think makes a big difference.
Well, let's talk about the everyone together. Tell me about the crew.
Okay, big crew. We had an amazing post team in New York, headed up by first assistant editor Ulysses Guidotti, first assistant Rich Molina, second assistant editor Elena Castro, VFX editor Dan Lyons, music editor Jonathan Zalbin. The VFX team was incredible. Our VFX producer Lauren Ritchie, our coordinator Aaron Anderson, VFX supervisor Mark Russell, post supervisor Jeff Penman, Taylor Hayes, Doan James. I mean, all of these people, we had a large team and we had a great team. And it was one of the best experiences, if not the best experience I've ever had as far as working with these people. And you know that it's not realistic to think that you will all do everything again together for the rest of your lives, but it sure would be nice because there was not a bad apple in the bunch. And I think everyone really had a wonderful time, in addition to being proud of the work that we were all doing together. And I'd be remiss too to not mention the post sound team, Paul Shue, our brilliant supervising sound editor and mixer, Eugene Garrity, who is our mixer, and their whole crew, including Kenton Jacob and Craig and Maya. The sound was such a huge part of the movie, and they did so much work from a very early stage all the way through the mix. And I'm just so proud of everything that we all did together, but it was just a lovely group.
Let's talk a little story. I always like to spend a few minutes talking about the open of a film or of a TV series because that's such a crucial component to getting the story going. I thought this was interesting in that the first character we're focused on is Carter Ford, Post Malone's character. And then you reveal the hero, Dalton. Even though we don't start with him, the conceit of the film starts right away. The character Frankie goes up to Dalton and says, hey, I got this Roadhouse in Florida. Even though he's not, quote, a cooler like Patrick Swayze was in the original, he's an ex-UFC fighter. Very expeditious open, which as a viewer you love because like, hey, let's get right to it. Tell me about how that might have been structured initially and then restructured or tightened. Tell me about how you built that open.
You've seen a lot of movies, Matt. You can see these things. This was not how it was written.
I kind of figured.
That was one of the first things that I really wanted to try once I was getting a feel for the movie. We had a much more traditional opening with the components that you see in that scene, you know, Dalton pulling up in the car, the exterior shot of that sort of barn, warehouse fight place, and all kind of the same components. But as it was originally structured, it was kind of quiet and slow, and Dalton pulls up and he walks in, and then you go inside and this Post Malone fight is happening, and then Jessica Williams comes in, and then you kind of check back in with Dalton, and then you kind of get into it as it is. But I felt like it didn't have enough of a grab you by the shirt and pull you in. And also we were trying to figure out what's the best kind of hero introduction for Dalton, you know, because that scene ends with such a fun moment where Post Malone says, I'm not going to fight this guy. And you've got kind of that hero shot of Jake standing up and he looks super strong and he's getting paid the money and he kind of laughs it off. So we knew we were building to that. And so then you kind of reverse engineer it and think about, okay, what's our best way to end up there? So I thought it would be fun to sort of, I mean, this is Roadhouse. So what's a better way in than point of view punching someone in the face to just sort of suck you in, start to feel that world, that rowdiness, that violence. Also to bring Jessica Williams in, asking about Carter Ford, which you don't know who Carter Ford is at that point, but just sort of starting people asking questions about where am I? What is this? So that the answer to that question effectively is this is Dalton, and he comes in, and it's a much weightier intro when you see him in the hood, but you don't really see his face after you've started to ask all those questions. So much of this process is always about trying things and seeing if they work or not. And for me, the best way to do that is you try it and then you show it to people who aren't in the room all day, you know? So it's not me deciding whether or not I think this works in a vacuum. It's not Doug deciding whether or not he thinks this works in a vacuum, but it's pulling in somebody from our team down the hall. Like our post PA Doan was always game to come in and watch something. And he's really smart, has great taste, and is like the perfect audience member to just kind of put it up, hit play, see how he reacts. And then that tells you everything you need to know if it works or not. And then, of course, on a larger scale, we did a lot of friends and family screenings and things like that. So we had some screenings with the original opening, some screenings with kind of the reworked opening. And once we put that on the front of the movie in that version, it seemed to work for people. And it became something that people wanted to talk about after because they liked it. So that was a good sign for us.
Obviously, this film is not just fighting. There are certainly personal beats and comedic beats and things like that in the film. Comparing the two types of scenes, I think there's probably a challenge to any kind of scene, regardless of what it is. But in an action sequence, does it feel like that's harder because of the kinetic style of editing? Or does it feel like a more personal, slower sequence is challenging because the edits are more obvious? If you get one wrong, it's going to really strike a dissonant note, whereas in a high-intensity action scene, you may not feel it the same way.
Yeah, it's a great point. I mean, I think with this one specifically, the action scenes were certainly their own set of challenges, and the process, which we can talk about, was something we were kind of all figuring out as we went. But certainly there's a lot more going on visually, which makes them much more forgiving, as you mentioned, than kind of the smaller scenes. So I think the trick with this movie and what really got it sort of clicked in and working was when we got some of those smaller scenes dialed in. I think specifically for me, one of the scenes or a couple of the scenes that I love is the scenes when Jake interacts with the little girl whose dad owns the bookstore, because it gives you a different view of the character. It gives you a moment to breathe, and it really is grounded in a neat way. And for this movie, finding moments where we could ground things, knowing that there are so many other moments that are giant and insane and over the top, finding the opportunities to ground things in stuff was something that I was always looking for. And we'd get into those scenes and rework them and just get them dialed in just right. Suddenly, the whole movie would start to feel better because we had these slight glimpses into Dalton's character through the eyes of this little girl in the bookstore, or the scenes with Dalton and Ellie when they're talking. And it was just more insight into him. And he's still this mysterious character, but you get these glimpses, and that makes you, I think, lean forward and want to watch the rest of the movie.
For scenes like that, obviously you have the script to draw from, and the performances give you, I think, more of a direction. But in an action sequence, is there anything in the script that says, well, this is how this sequence should go or feel?
I mean, you use it as a guide, knowing like, okay, so Jake's going to say this line and then Connor's going to say that line. You know, you have that sort of as your blueprint, but certainly all of the action stuff was choreographed meticulously in the space. Garrett Warren, who was the second unit director and stunt coordinator, and then Steve Brown, who was a fight coordinator, and he was the second unit stunt coordinator. Those two guys are just incredible. And they worked tirelessly to kind of get all of that laid out, and then would present it to Doug. And then, of course, Doug would work with them, get it to be what he wanted. So by the time it's shooting, it's this like choreographed dance. And as I mentioned with the footage, you know, you look at the raw takes and they would tell you the story. It was very clear, okay, we're going to be in this shot for this moment until the camera pans over here. And then we're going to stitch this shot with that shot to make it feel like one for this next moment where we go past the band or whatever it is. So that stuff was very well planned and well shot, and it made it the different kind of challenge putting it together because you were looking for a lot of invisible ways to put things together, because the more it would feel like one shot, the more it would be like what Doug was going for. So whenever we could make it feel like that, we did.
So when you say having it well planned out or laid out for you, we're talking about like stunt viz?
Yeah, there were stunt viz videos, and the process of making some of those fight connections look real was something that they developed leading up to the movie and tried with stunt viz videos very successfully. So the process was, there were multiple passes, like talking about the fist fight or the brawl at the bar with Jake and Connor, which is one of my favorite scenes. So that scene, multiple passes. So like in the sections where Jake and Connor have hand-to-hand combat stuff going on, there would be a traditional Hollywood pass, you know, with pulled punches, just the normal way of doing it. And that was like the backup plan, basically. But we need to have it. Then there would be a pass where Connor would step out and Garrett would step in, the stunt coordinator, with a pad. And he'd be holding a pad where Connor was. And Jake would stay in the frame. And they'd do that shot as close as they could to matching the exact movement and everything. But none of this was motion controlled because, as I mentioned, Henry's got his specialized rig, but it's a handheld stabilized rig. So nothing was on a motion control camera, which is also what makes this whole thing kind of crazy. But then they do the take. Jake would beat the crap out of this pad. And these guys were so rehearsed. I mean, Jake was in fight training for months leading up to this movie. He was like a real fighter. And then, of course, Connor, his level of precision with like the fake punches and stuff. I mean, Jake would talk about how in the Hollywood pass, you know, the pulled punch version, Connor was so precise with his fists. He can get within millimeters of your face consistently every time and never hit you. But imagine how scary that is. So anyway, so there's the Hollywood pass. Then there's this pass where Jake's doing the punching to a pad. Then once you do a few takes of that and you feel good about that, you switch it over. So then Connor comes in, Garrett's holding a pad for Connor, Jake steps out, Connor beats the crap out of the pad of Jake. Then after that, both guys step back in and you do passes very slowly where you're going at like, you know, anywhere from 25% the speed to like 10% the speed. And they're actually connecting with each other's faces so that you're physically seeing like the smushing, you know, that happens when a fist hits a face. And the head is moving at the exact time. Because one of the things that always looks fake in Hollywood fights is that people's fists and the movement of the head are never perfectly in sync because they're just guessing. As rehearsed as you can be, you're still guessing. So this was getting movement in body parts and faces from impact based on the actual physical pushing of it. And then, of course, all the distortion that comes with that on skin. So we'd have all of that and then start to stitch it together from that and try and make it look as seamless as possible. Yeah, it was wild.
So for the pad shots, I'm assuming that those are exclusively the POV shots that you see, or is there a way to use those shots where you've removed Connor or Jake and doing something digitally, or is it really just the POV stuff?
No, it was all of the fight stuff, or most of the fight stuff, not just the POV stuff. So then there's a ton of roto happening, and you're basically ending up with a plate for the scene, a background plate, which incorporates all the people, the patrons in the bar. You're ending up with a Connor element, a Jake element, and then you're painting around pads and stuff so that you're keeping, like, you want to see Jake's fist and what that does to his arm when his impact happens in a pad. So you're painting out the pad and then you're putting it back into Connor, and then you're going in and taking the elements you have of Connor where he looks like he's getting hit, where there is that distortion, and you're putting that on him and then trying to make it look like it's all one.
I don't know, Doc. That sounds like a lot of work.
It was a lot of work for a lot of people for a long time.
And so the Hollywood pass, would you use that as your, if this works, then we know that we can then go in and do the replacements? Or was it really just, okay, we're going to use the Hollywood pass for this section, then I'm going to try the pad fight for this section?
The Hollywood pass was a great kind of roadmap. Going back to your question about how much does the script tell you about the fight, not much. But the Hollywood pass told you a lot because that was a visual representation of the intentions. It just looked less real than we wanted it to because they're pulling punches. But no, we always did this process that I described for all the fighting. I mean, there were some instances in the movie where it was more dynamic and it looked real to cut to the Hollywood pass, but more often than not, the fighting that you see on screen is some version of this process. And of course, each moment was a little different as far as what you did. Like in some moments, it wasn't someone punching a pad, but instead it was Jake holding a pad and hitting someone with the pad. And so each moment kind of lent itself to some specificity, and then you figure out how to put it all back together so that it feels real and seamless and invisible.
Doc, I got all these questions about what tricks did you use to do these fight sequences? They all just went out the window. Is there anything left to the tricks?
Oh, yeah. I mean,
I was going to ask about speed ramps, but obviously you've got people performing at 25%. Obviously, that's a speed ramp.
Of course.
I'll just leave it open-ended. Doc, what other little tricks are there beyond the amazing array of things you did just to create a fight sequence?
All the normal fight sequence tricks were still deployed too. You know, speed ramps, adjusting arms, sometimes moving people's full bodies in the frame so they're a little closer to where it looks like they're going to get impacted, cutting out frames here and there, just taking one frame here and there, invisible cuts around people's backs, and many more things like that. So all the traditional tools were deployed as well within this new thing we were trying to figure out. It was all part of the soup we were making.
So part of that soup includes live music. I mean, you get these big fight sequences with live bands playing. How did you cut those sequences together? Because you've got a band performing amidst all this other noise going on.
Yeah, so they were all there, and for the most part, live to playback. And it was a great texture, I think, that Doug was very adamant about, like having the live music in the bar whenever we were there, and that the band would not just be in the background, but would have its moments where they're part of the fight, whether it's because somebody threw a bottle at them or whether it's because the drummer decides to stop playing and jump into the brawl. He was very keen on that. So with that in mind, the way that a lot of the stuff was shot, it just incorporated them in the background. And yeah, you can imagine with that comes an extra set of challenges when you're cutting a scene together, because all we're really trying to do with any of this stuff when we're cutting a scene together is give the illusion that this is all playing out in real time, but none of it is ever playing out in real time when you're shooting it. So naturally, parts of songs wouldn't quite line up, you know, in different takes. You'd be 3 seconds later on the band, which would mean they were 3 seconds later into the song, and that's the best take for that moment. But then, of course, there's a better take for a different moment. So all the normal stuff that comes with playback music numbers and what I would equate to is just like dialogue scenes on top of playback music, except much more complicated than just a normal dialogue scene. But the same kind of walls that you run into with things not matching were things that we just had to find our way around and work through.
When you were describing the different elements of the fight scene, the Hollywood pass, the slow-mo pass, the pad pass, even though you didn't say it implicitly, and I guess I should have asked, in my head I was seeing a timeline where you're layering up from all those different things. Definitely let me know if I'm wrong about that. But on the audio side, I'm wondering the same thing. Like, how do you build up from the music with all those different stems, the dialogue, the wall of the impact of the punches, just a crazy number of audio elements going on at the same time?
Yeah, we were really fortunate on this one because we had an amazing sound team. Paul Shue, who's a supervising sound editor, and our mixer, he was involved very early in the process, starting to do passes on the movie. And I don't think we would have been able to do it without him at that stage. So he was building tons of things, whether you're talking about punches early on, but by the time we were putting the movie in front of people, he had already taken a pass on it. So it was already sounding really good. But you make choices about sound in the same way that you make choices about picture. You know, if you're looking at a couple different kinds of coverage in a scene and you're deciding which actor you're going to be on at a certain time, when you get a bar that's really busy like that, you're doing the same thing with your ears. You're deciding, is it more important during this fight that we hear this guy screaming whatever at the guy he's about to tackle, or is it more important that we have the music driving us? And do we just want that yelling to be more of like a texture where you feel that this guy's yelling, but maybe it's not as articulate, like you don't actually understand what he's saying, it's not as discernible, or vice versa. Sometimes we just want to feel the presence of the music in the background there, but what's really important is what's being said here. I think with sound, you should always be approaching it and thinking about it in the same way you think a picture edit. It's like if you're physically shooting something yourself in a camera and you're deciding what you want to pull focus to, you know, you do that with your ears.
When you're trying to make both of those things work, do you isolate them? In other words, if you're working on an action sequence or a fight sequence, do you try and do it without any sound so that visually you know that it's working?
Yeah, I often will turn sound off when I'm cutting to make sure things work and make sure that I'm on the right track visually. And also I do it as a check, even with dialogue scenes. Sometimes, you know, if there are moments where I'm cutting between two takes and things don't match perfectly, I'll turn off sound and watch the cut a few times to make sure that visually it works well enough that we can get away with it. Because then you know that, okay, now it's a matter of the sound between A and B is different enough, and that's what's pulling me out, and we can fix that down the road.
I think you mentioned this when you were talking about them laying out the action scenes, the fight scenes, and stitching things together, like this piece is going to be stitched to this piece. In an action sequence, do you identify key beats within that scene first and just sort of build around that? Like, you know that I love the way this punch connects, or I really need this move to keep the geography correct.
Yeah, I think so. I think a lot of times it's about taking the most kind of exciting moments or the kind of the hero moments of the scene. And sometimes those are clear on a script level. Sometimes those become clear once you see it visually. What are the coolest shots of each moment? And oftentimes I think I'm thinking about it like, how do we paint ourselves into this corner? This is the corner we want to get in. So what's the best way to paint ourselves into it? And then, of course, how do we get out of this corner? And how do we get to the next corner? And like, I think that's often the approach with any action scene. You either know going in or you know once you watch the footage where the real exciting stuff is. And then it's about getting from A to B to C so that you're highlighting each of those moments in the best possible way.
I know that you're a big proponent of script sync, and typically people think of a tool like that as, well, that's how I manage dialogue. But I've also heard of editors, and this surprised me the first few times I heard it, using it for action where they'll group kicks and punches and things like that just to be able to quickly go through different looks at a punch within that script sync window. Is that something you tried to do at all here?
Not on this one, but I have done that in the past where we sort of make our own script in script sync. You know, we're putting in our own text and we're using it just like you would for dialogue, but for action beats and stuff. And it's very effective. This one was a little different because with so much of the action, we weren't cutting it in the traditional way. So we weren't cycling through to say which of these punches looks the most believable in the Hollywood Pass version, you know? So I didn't use it in that way for this because kind of there were different considerations as we were evaluating those shots and figuring out which ones to stitch together. But It is very effective, I think. I'm glad you mentioned that as far as grouping things other than just dialogue.
When you have a very tightly choreographed, tightly cut action sequence and you're going through these reviews and Doug says, Doc, we got to lose a few seconds here. Is it much more challenging in that kind of scene to make changes at the end for timing?
It can be when it's that intricately choreographed. Sometimes it's not as easy as just pulling out a punch or two because there isn't a lot of redundancies in these fights. There were a couple of moments. Of course, there's a moment towards the end of that brawl where Jake's being held back and Connor is just punching him and punching him and punching him. That was a moment where we did experiment with how many punches. We had versions where it was one punch. We had versions where it was twice as many punches as what ended up in the movie and everything in between. But in a lot of other instances, they were moving around so much within the space. There might be a punch thrown, but the next thing isn't a punch. It's a kick that trips someone, and then suddenly they're on the ground. So you can't lift that kick out because then they teleport to the ground. So you can imagine, because it was all kind of wrapped up together, a lot of that stuff, it was what it was. And we, of course, found ways when we needed to tighten things to do so. But a lot of that stuff was as it was shot on the day because that was what was baked in from a very early and confident place in Doug's mind.
So you have two very different leads in the form of Jake Gyllenhaal and Conor McGregor. You have Jake, who is a very well-trained actor, and then you have Conor, who's acting for the first time. Tell me about what you were seeing in that footage and the way that Doug was working with them.
So they obviously come at it very differently, and their performance in the movie are very different from each other. And that was one of the challenges. I think comparing those two performances to me sort of encapsulates one of the biggest challenges with this movie, which was tone. Figuring out how to balance this very real, grounded performance from Jake and what he's playing for Dalton with this larger-than-life, over-the-top sort of agent of chaos that Conor brings to it. So I think that it was really interesting to watch. I mean, Conor has the discipline that you would expect from someone who is at the top of a sport, or was at the top of a sport, and what it took to get there. I think that coming into it, he was committed to doing whatever he needed to do to try and make the acting part of it work as well as his fighting component of his life does. So I think that he and Jake found a really good rhythm with each other. And there was a lot of mutual respect between them from what I saw of sort of, these are two people who are at the top of different games, but they have a respect that they're each at the top of their own game. And as they worked together, they got even better and better, I think, their kind of chemistry on screen. And their tension between each other on screen. It was a lot of fun to watch. But yeah, I think between those two characters, that was the biggest tightrope walk of the movie. Finding the tone that works, where it's serious enough, where there are stakes, and where you emotionally connect with Dalton, but also it's not so serious that you don't feel like you have permission to laugh at any given moment. And that was the key. Anytime we felt the movie was taking itself a little too seriously, it wasn't that the movie was taking itself too seriously, because we never let the movie take itself too seriously in our minds, but we wanted to make sure the audience didn't feel like the movie was taking itself too seriously. So we were always looking for moments just at the edge. Then you undercut it with humor. I think one of the best examples is when Jake kills the guy in the pool towards the end. And then he's taking the body out and he throws the body in the back of the pickup truck. And then you go to Arturo, who every time the guy opens his mouth, he's hilarious in the movie. And you have those comedic moments. It was a trick to make sure that we didn't go too far with the drama, but also that it didn't become so jokey that the stakes weren't real, or that the emotional through lines with the characters, be it Dalton's internal story or Dalton and Charlie, the little girl at the bookstore, you want that stuff to still work too. And if you're too jokey with the other stuff, then that won't work.
I'm glad you brought up the tone and the challenge of balancing that, because the character of Dalton here, I think, is a little more complicated, has a darker past, has a history that you are careful to reveal over time.
Yes.
There is a common touch point or flashback here when he was a UFC fighter. You're having to move things around. You're having to tighten and expand and keep the pace going, but you've got to reveal those things about him. You've got to go back to that flashback and show a little more each time. Tell me about how that element might have moved around, or the challenge of working that in.
Oh, yeah. I mean, it's a great question. We experimented a ton with the flashbacks as far as where they would come in the movie. And the biggest thing, and this is something that I think is like so important to editing, is asking yourself, when is the best time for the audience to know a piece of information? So, of course, with this movie, the big piece of information was that Dalton did something in the ring that was irretrievable and irreversible to another person. And you have to ask yourself, when is the most interesting time to find that out? Is it more interesting to meet the guy and have a flashback early in the movie and be like, oh, wow, he was a UFC fighter. Oh, it looks like he killed somebody in the ring and now he's a bouncer? Like, that's one version of it that you could try, and we did. And then, of course, the other version, well, many other versions led us down the path of ultimately making sure that we wait it to reveal the full story until after you've sort of been on this journey with Dalton. And a lot of that, I think, is trial and error. Of course, the script was a guide, and I think where we ended up, if I remember correctly, was not too far off from the script in that it was a delayed reveal. It wasn't something we were coming out of the gate with. But, you know, each of those flashbacks too, they're pieces that are sort of their own little pods that you can slide around the movie. So you can turn dials on a character or a scene by having the flashback either at the beginning of the scene or having the scene and then the flashback. And that those have, you know, that can swing a direction of something wildly. So we did a ton of experimentation on where those went. And number of them, I believe there are 3 in the movie now. We tried versions of the movie where we had 2. We tried versions where we had 4, maybe even 5 at some. It wouldn't surprise me if we went further. But it was a lot of trial and error. And again, putting the movie up in front of people and feeling kind of what feels good to them, where the movie, you can feel it in a room if the movie's feeling long to people, and asking yourself, is it feeling long because we have too many flashbacks and they're getting ahead of it? And also thinking about each specific flashback as, what is the new information in this flashback that we're getting that warrants us having a flashback here? Can't just be another flashback to he was a UFC fighter. If you do that a few times, that's really boring. So we wanted to make sure that we were building each one to something, to that end. And with each flashback, asking ourselves, well, what are the pieces that we want in this flashback that weren't in the last one? Or sometimes we were moving pieces from one flashback to another to try and just modulate that to the sweet spot.
You're cutting these really fantastic fight scenes in a small environment. How did you affirm that your cuts were right, the timing was right when you're working on a small screen? Did you actually have to see it on a big screen to know, like, yes, I've got it, and I don't have to make any changes?
It always is instructive to see it different sizes, whether that's seeing it on a big screen when you're cutting in a traditional edit room, whether it's watching scenes on your phone, and everything in between. I think that it's always going to feel different at different sizes. With this one, we were always putting it together with the idea of what it would feel like for a room full of people on a big screen. And I don't think we ever swayed from that with our approach as far as the creative side and as far as the cuts. And we did a lot of audience previews. We also did some internal screenings of our own in the screening room at Assembly, where we were cutting the movie in New York, so that we could see it big and we could feel it big. And then, of course, as we were getting ready for the audience previews, we're on a mix stage with Paul, our sound mixer and sound supervisor, watching it huge as well. So we were seeing it big a lot. It wasn't just seeing it the size of the screen in my room, which was helpful and always sort of would be a good gut check on things. But when you do see it big, you also see imperfections and you see things that make cuts bump that you don't notice on your phone or on a computer monitor. So that was also just a good thing too, where we could make sure that it was as smooth as it could be when we wanted it to be smooth. And then, of course, there are lots of cuts in the movie that are designed to not be smooth and, in fact, be visceral and a little different than smooth. But when we intended for things to be smooth and for the cuts to be invisible, of course, you want them to be that way. And I think seeing it big always helps.
Above all else, this is a very fun movie. You should have fun watching it. You certainly should have fun making it if at all possible. So I'll ask you this, Doc. What was your favorite scene from the film to work on?
Oh, good question. I don't know. I mean, this is going to sound crazy. I probably have a different answer for this every day, but you're asking me today. And I'm just thinking about how we talked about the scenes with Dalton and Charlie, the little girl. And it might sound crazy because we are talking about this big fight movie, Roadhouse, but I got a lot out of working on those scenes and reworking some of those scenes until we figured out what felt right for their relationship, where there was something sweet and simple and charming about it. And I think kind of I'm looking back on those scenes rather fondly too, because once we got those right, I saw the impact it had on the rest of the movie. So that was super fun. And then of course, like all the fight scenes and the boat scene, the boat chase and, all that stuff was great. I love the showdown with Jake and Connor at the end. Hard not to like that. Unless you don't like violence, then it's easy not to like that. But no, I mean, there were so many, but I think you're asking me today and having just thought about a little more about the Dalton Charlie stuff. Those are just sweet little scenes that I think really turned out well in a movie that I think probably surprises you that it has that sweetness.
Well, Doc, for our last question, I have to say I don't always take audience questions, although I probably should because mine are terrible and getting worse by the year. But I have this one question that came in for you.
Okay.
This is from D. Liman. It says, Dear Doc, there are big personalities on screen, for example, Connor and Jake, and big personalities in your edit room, for example, Doug and Joel. Can you speak to managing all of that?
Sure, I can speak to managing all of that. It's great that Doug has a self-awareness about it as well. I appreciate that. It's always tricky with these movies when there are multiple creative, smart people who have not the same idea about what the movie should be. I think that, as was the case with Roadhouse, and I think both Joel Silver, the producer, and Doug, the director, would say the same thing, which was like where we ended up as far as the movie was a movie that is somewhere between the tastes that they gravitate to. Their sort of styles, actually, even though they're very different from each other, for this project really complemented each other, because there were times where Joel was pushing for something to be a little more popcorny and actiony and big. And there were times where Doug was pushing for a moment to be much more grounded and real. And ultimately, there were lots of disagreements about that. And we tried lots of different things. We had lots of multiple versions of the movie at various points based on these different preferences. But ultimately, I think where we landed was a sweet spot in between their two sort of tastes where they would have taken the movie on their own. And I think it made for a better version of the movie. And as for managing all of that, sometimes you are an editor and sometimes you are just a listener or a therapist or whatever you want to, however you want to describe it. But for me, I think I'm always approaching it like I want to go in, I want to do great work. And it's amazing that we get to do this for a living. So let's have fun with it. Let's try things. Let's not argue over stuff in the hypothetical. Instead of spending 15 minutes arguing over whether or not we should try something, let's just try it, because then we can actually watch it. And then we can say if it's better or worse. And if we still disagree about it, we can go outside and go down the hallway and we can grab Doan or whoever from our team and have them watch. And they don't know who thinks which version is better, and just say, what do you think? Which one did you like? So that's always my approach. I think I just come at it from or try to come at it at least from a really practical, pragmatic standpoint of like, hey, we're disagreeing about things, but we can get to answers pretty quickly, and also just recognizing that everyone was in it for the same reason and everyone believed in what they were doing and their hearts were really in it, both with Doug and Joel. And that was clear. And for the rest of us too, so being respectful of that with each person.
Well, let it be said, whether you need an editor, a listener, or a therapist to manage those big-time personalities, you got to call the doctor.
That's a good one. I've not heard that before. Maybe I should put that on business cards.
Yeah, put that on the business card. Editors have to do everything. They have to be good at everything. They don't just have to cut. They have to listen to everyone's problems and manage all those big personalities, even manage the small personalities. Clearly, Doc is great at all those things. It was a blast having him on the show again, and what a cool project to talk about with Roadhouse. A big thank you to the doctor for making a house call for us today. Roadhouse is streaming on Amazon Prime right now, so check it out and have yourself a fun couple of hours. If you want to have fun for more than just a couple hours, you should get caught up on all the latest with Avid Media Composer. New transcription tools, new audio tools, new AI tools, all kinds of good stuff. And if you want to see for yourself, well, just click that link in the show notes that says Media Composer and let the internet do the rest. So our time is up for today. That's another way of saying the show's over. I do hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. At least enough to come back again next week. Until then, this is Matt Fury thanking you for joining me right here on The Rough Cut.